Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Horizon, the official podcast from the UNA Climate and Oceans. Today, I'm joined by John Roberts, a leading expert in global energy security and geopolitics. John has spent decades analysing how oil, gas, and infrastructure shapes international relations, with a particular focus on pipeline politics, European energy strategy, and the shifting balances of global power. His work has taken him across some of the most strategically important energy regions in the world. He's advised governments, institutions, and organizations on how energy systems intersect with economies, security, and conflict. At a time when global energy markets are under immense pressure, from geopolitical tensions to the accelerating energy transition, there are few people better placed to help us understand this very interesting field. I'm also joined today by Gonzalo Alvarez, who is the chairman of the United Nations Association for Climate and Oceans, who will be conducting this interview alongside me. So, John, to start broadly, when we say energy security, what does that actually sort of mean in today's world?
Bottom line, it actually means the supply of energy from the point of view of us Europeans, who are primarily consumers. Now, the key point there is that there are all sorts of elements that you need to bear in mind. Let's go to what is traditionally called the energy trilemma, the whole question of energy security, energy affordability, and energy sustainability. There's a problem right now because of things like, shall we say, the Ukraine war, the tensions at the Strait of Hormuz. The prime issue right now is energy security. That means, from the point of view of consumers, getting the oil and gas that we want. And from the point of view of producers in the Gulf, it means getting their oil and gas to market, which they have problems doing right now. That has become right now more important than affordability. But what happens if, for instance, supplies run so short that you see demonstrations and riots? What happens if political tensions spark because the price of oil at the petrol at the petrol pump, just gets too high for people to bear? I don't think we're there anywhere like that now, but it's something to bear in mind. And then, of course, there's the question of sustainability. We have a problem. In 2024, annual warming was 1.6 centigrade above what it had been in pre-industrial levels, which is just above the 1.5 trigger point that the UN identified as signifying, in its effect, we're in a dangerous era in climate change. And that was 2024. Last year was even worse, particularly for Europe, which now is increasing its annual heating by twice as much as the rest of the world. We are accelerating. So we've got a really serious multiple problem. But as I say, if you're a business, but perhaps even above all, if you're trying to look after your own families and home, it's the price you pay for energy that's important. That's the affordability issue. And it's getting it in the first place, which is why right now, despite everything that I really want to see in terms of sustainability and the need to combat climate change, we have a focus on fossil fuels.
You touched on it there. I mean, we have post the Ukraine war. I say post the Ukraine war, since the start of the Ukraine war, and the sort of energy transition that you've just touched on there, would you say that that has significantly changed the definition of energy security? Whereas it used to be very much sort of, it was all about, like you said there, the supply and demand of fossil fuels. Are we sort of getting different sort of aspects coming in due to those two factors?
Yes, we certainly are. I mean, it is significant that neither you nor I have actually mentioned renewables so far. And that is, I regret, a big omission on my part. because they are going to play a much greater role. They're already playing a significant role. The entirety of the increase in global electricity demand last year was accounted for by renewables. So that's good. So we're starting to make the transition. We just have got a long, long way to go. But in terms of energy security right now, the problem is we have existed on an international trade system that assumed free passage, obviously on commercial rates, of oil and gas around the world. This has been disrupted, one, by the Russian withholding of gas to Europe in the wake of their invasion of Ukraine, their all out invasion of Ukraine in February 22. And then you have the second thing, which is the Strait of Hormuz, shortage of conventional fossil fuels. With all of this, it means, can we rely on international trade to balance? Well, the answer is, in one sense, yes. But that means if you can pay for it. Now, we happen to be in Europe. Europe happens to be one of the richer continents. Indeed, you could argue it's the richest continent, possibly from North America. So, yes, we can buy our way out of this crisis and, in effect, leave it to our governments or to institutions in the European Union to try to find some way of ameliorating the price for the poorest. But what does this do globally? What does this do to Africa? What does this do for India? What does this do for Pakistan? For countries with large populations that simply cannot afford massive increases that will occur as a result of shortages or reduced supply of oil and gas. So we need investment in renewables.
Yes.
And renewables have two advantages in this geopolitical context. One, they are far more spread out. And two, in effect, they can be developed much more on a national basis. Now, I separate Europe out from this because there are substantial European institutions that should ensure a relatively high degree of interdependence concerning energy and energy distribution that may not be the case elsewhere in the world. Increasingly, I think we are going to see most nations pursue our country first policy in terms of how they handle their energy. And renewables will help in that, but they will require substantial investment because while you can produce much more wind and solar, more or less anywhere, you do need a proper power distribution system, an integrated grid. You need storage, whether it's battery storage or hydropower, or it is not easy for nations to adapt. It's going to be difficult for Europe enough. It's going to be much harder for much of the rest of the world.
As we have seen, you mentioned obviously the war in Ukraine and then the conflict in the Middle East, particularly with Iran, the Strait of Hormuz and everything. It seems that the new geopolitical landscape, it's shaping now for governments. The national security is more an issue of national security, where we see that energy can be weaponized. We saw it with Russia, for example, didn't we? In with the restrictions to Europe, the Nord Stream and the Drushba, I think, pipelines and so on, and now in Iran in the Strait there in Hormuz. What are your thoughts about that? That it's becoming for governments an issue of national security, and as a result, we see this defense in infrastructure as well developing. Whether that, as you, in my view, you're pointing out, that investment should be put more into renewables to take us out of this dependence of foreign energy and oil, particularly, and fossil fuels. What do you think? What do you think about those thoughts?
In general, I agree with them. But the key point I would make concerning the energy as a weapon, is it is such a big weapon. You can only effectively use it once in such a form as Russia has used it in regard to curbing its gas supplies to Europe, or indeed as Iran has done by attacking the Qatari LNG production plant, and then, in effect, closing the Strait of Hormuz. Why do I say it could only be used once? Because painful as it is, we have almost completely emerged from the Russian gas cutoff with hits to our gross domestic product, with destruction of some industry, but we have emerged. We no longer need it. Now, what happens with regard to oil and gas from the Gulf? My guess is that we won't like it. It will be very, very painful because prices will be high, but we will adapt. And once you have blocked the Strait of Hormuz completely, which I put both Iran and the US in the frame on this, you've broken a taboo. The taboo that it would never be closed, which means if, and we all hope it will be, it reopens, do we expect it to remain open in the casual manner in which we assumed, despite everything, despite the 8 years of the Iran-Iraq war, despite the US and allied assault on Iraq in 1991 with Desert Storm and the subsequent invasion in 2003, we assumed that normal traffic through the strait was there in effect forever. We can no longer make that assumption. Even if it reopens, we know it can be closed again. So therefore, we are going to do our damnedest to work out how we can bypass it so that the Gulf supply of energy becomes an extra, a bonus, not a necessity. That's going to take time. It's going to take years. But the answer to that is renewables. The development of wind and solar, together with the concomitant development of the electricity grids to carry oil, to carry wind and solar, and of course, the need for backup, the need for power storage. None of these come particularly cheaply. You can produce the wind and solar with relative ease. Much tougher to develop the grids to carry them and the storage to protect us. And that's why, for quite some time, the gas that we have got and additional supplies of gas that we might hope to get, whether it is from existing producers like the United States, or it is, as it were, an expansion of existing production from, say, Azerbaijan, is extremely important in the overall context. Perhaps I would say for the next 10 years or so.
Synthesize like sort of 2 points that you sort of made there. Like, would you say that as a result of us now knowing that the Strait of Hormuz can be closed effectively. Obviously, there was the initiating factors, but at any point now, we know that it can be closed because it has been closed, as you said. Do you think that's going to drive not just the growth in renewables, but more sort of as an idea you postulated earlier, as towards individual energy independence? So each country is going to develop their own infrastructure, their own system to effectively decentralize the energy network. So it's not relying on choke points like Hormuz, like Russia, so that if something else blows up, they can't instigate this sort of pressure on the global economy. It will be regional conflicts that will affect it because there's no sort of, you're going to lose that global intercompatibility into reliance on each other for energy supplies.
Absolutely. I think this is going to be very much the case in most of the world. The exception may be Europe, precisely because there are both European institutions that are working to promote continued interdependence and to ease energy links between neighbours, but also because there is an increasing understanding that Europe's energy security, that Europe's basic core security is a continental-wide issue. In other words, it's the European element of, shall we say, NATO. So while we may have doubts about the US role in NATO, we know de facto that Germany, Britain, France, and perhaps above all Poland realize they have to work together in order to counter what is conceived of as an ongoing threat from Russia, which is currently being held at bay by Ukraine. In this context, things like the strength of Finland become very important as well. But the key point is we have institutions within Europe that probably still favor integration in energy. Those are not necessary. That is not necessarily the case in most of the world, where we are talking about disintegrating energy links and a natural feeling that that each country needs to make sure it can provide for its own people.
And do you think that some of that comes from that sort of attitude towards interdependence comes from the fact that of the European Union being everything being within the trade union, within the customs union already, you don't have any sort of like tensions between individual states, and therefore it already creates an environment in which you almost treat all those states as one country, and that one country, the European Union, will become energy independent, but not the member states themselves.
If you asked individual countries, they would say no to that. They would argue that they are working for their own, and you will find there have been plenty of disputes between countries within the EU over how they should cooperate or not cooperate on energy issues. But overall, the point you made at the beginning, that there are major European-wide institutions, notably the single market and indeed the common currency, plus the steady development of common regulatory practices throughout the area, make it much more straightforward to boost interdependence, make it far more logical. And so I'm not too worried about the disputes that there are, because it is still important to realize that national governments will fight their corner for as much, as great a degree of energy autonomy as they could possibly secure. But I think you're going to find that that will be a parallel path to interdependence, paradoxically as it may seem. Whereas I don't see that parallel path necessarily taking place in much of the rest of the world.
When Russia started weaponizing energy and also was sanctioned, obviously for economic reasons, at the start of the war, Europe, it seems to me that moved quite rapidly into LNG supplies, particularly from Qatar and the USA. But now, as we move into renewables, and that's you made a very very strong case for that for countries to move into renewables and to invest and so on. Critical minerals, it seems to me, they're now central into global power politics. And as we know, a lot of that, for example, those critical minerals are controlled by China. They've been preparing for this, it seems, for quite a long time. How do you see that movement? We are in a transition at the moment. So how do you see that transition into more renewable energy, which is what it seems the solution at sort of sovereign states?
We are going to have problems in securing the critical minerals we need. There are potential sources that are not under Chinese control. There's quite a lot in Central Asia, notably in Kazakhstan. Question, how do we get it out? Do we have a practical middle corridor that avoids passage through either Russia or, in this context, Iran? That is a subject I think we'll come back to. But the key point is there are alternatives. The question is, how much are we prepared to pay to use those alternatives? Or how much do we decide that under these circumstances, do we regard China as a greater threat or as a potential partner? I don't think we know the answer to that, because certainly in security terms, we regard China as a threat. Many of us, not everybody, but in Europe, worry about China as a threat. But at the same time, China is now emerging as an economic superpower. How can you ignore an economic superpower? This is not the Soviet Union, which was strong militarily, but weak economically. This is a country that is strong militarily and economically, that has an outreach throughout the world now. Is it going to be part of a new global system that is, as we would have said in the past, international and rules-based? Or is it an international system in which China basically lays down the terms? If it's the former, we can clearly do business with it, and will want to. If it's the latter, we're going to have some very expensive choices to make.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point as well, because obviously, especially in terms of battery technology, China is obviously leagues ahead of anyone else in the world in terms of their capacity, their storage, their speed of charging them, even if we talk about electric cars, for example. But also the fact that they've now got solid state battery technology that's really coming through. And we've just no one else has really even looked into solid state. I mean, there's been a few projects in Europe, for example, but they're the ones that are really pushing it forward. Because if we're sort of going to go more towards renewables, because we're trying to wean ourselves off from gas, oil, etc., not just from a sort of wars-based, control-based perspective, but also from an environmental perspective, are we going to end up in a situation where effectively going to have another Strait of Hormuz, that being China, for the supply of battery, of technology, of the equipment that we require to perform that green energy transition, which means that China could effectively, again, hold the world economy to ransom because we've weaned ourselves off of fossil fuels, but we can no longer get what we require to back support ourselves with green energy, which is coming from China. And therefore, if China is going to be, as you said there, going to be sort of laying down the terms, is it imperative to make sure that the development and the construction of our technologies comes from, again, a more centralized perspective rather than it being a complete outshipment to China?
What was the problem with the amount of gas that Russia supplied Europe? The answer was that there was no problem in buying as much gas as we wanted from Europe, so long as we had an insurance policy. So long as we were capable not merely of buying gas from elsewhere in extremis, but also of distributing it throughout Europe to the places that would need it, should there be a Russian gas cutoff.
Yeah.
And broadly speaking, by the skin of our teeth, we just about had achieved that and were able to put the final touches into place in the couple of years after the Ukrainian invasion of 22. But, and it's a really big but, how do we do that? How do we apply that to China? How do we make sure that we can not only, that we, in order to do business with China in a safe manner, we have a backup, we have an insurance policy. The insurance policy I think that we're going to need is the ability to get rare earths from other than China, the ability to manufacture much more of what we need, whether it is the giant blades for windmills or whether it is the components required for solar panels. We need to be much better at large-scale battery storage. We had some examples. South Australia is got that already. I think, though, that it's not all doom and gloom. At the moment, much of these technologies seem expensive, but take the example of the LED light bulb. Used to be, I don't know what, 20, 30, 40, 100 times what it costs today. And that's within the last 15, 20 years that it's come down to something that is so cheap you can buy one and not notice it in many parts of the world. Now, can we do that with batteries? Can we reach the stage where psychologically an idée fixe mind like me, who relies on his petrol or diesel driven cars to get me the 400 miles I want to go to visit my family, can know that I can do that on a single battery charge in an EV? Now, EVs are now routinely, they can do about 250 miles, about 400 kilometers without too much trouble. The Chinese have got the batteries now that give them 50% above that. They're more or less reaching the level I want to use. But it has to come down in price. It has to have longevity. And it has to have simplicity. But by comparison with the situation that we were at 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago when I first drove an EV, this is astonishing, the progress, the rapid transformation. So I don't doubt that all these things will come about with indigenous elements or with non-Chinese elements and with multivariants in terms of sources. But I don't think it'll necessarily come about all that quickly.
Yeah.
So we're going to have a very rough transition, I would say, for the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And if in that time, shall we say, heaven forfend, we see an invasion by the People's Republic of China of Taiwan, then all bets are off.
You mentioned two key things here in your previous intervention. The insurance policy in terms of energy supply, because Europe, we will still consuming, and we're not natural producers, as you pointed out. And you also mentioned the middle corridor. What is your view of that insurance policy becoming increasingly pointing towards the Caspian Sea to, securing this transition as in the next few years, because we can't rely 100% on renewables yet. However, during this transition, the Caspian Sea to Europe, for example, the imports of Georgia, Turkey, Greece, Italy, and particularly it seems Azerbaijan as well. How do you see that middle corridor there developing in helping this transition in those two fronts, not only into natural gas on the one hand, but also critical minerals?
Can I take it in two parts? And please push me on the second part. But the first part is simply the fossil fuel element.
Yeah.
The existing infrastructure that carries oil and gas from Azerbaijan to Turkey and then onwards to Europe, that's working fine, working very well indeed. The interesting element is that the oil pipeline is only running at half capacity for perfectly natural reasons, which is the aging of the Azerbaijani oil fields that would normally fill it. So the spare capacity there, that if you could get the oil from across the Caspian, from Kazakhstan, could go into the system. Problem there, you need to develop a new fleet of tankers to carry the oil across, all air pipeline.
So it's infrastructure, the issue there.
It's a construction issue there.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But there is capacity. There's even a little bit of spare capacity on the gas system. And the gas system would be easier to expand anyway, because you wouldn't need to lay new pipe to begin with. You would simply need to add new compressor stations to service the existing pipes that go to Turkey and then through Greece and Albania on to Italy. So you've got space there, for instance, for gas from Turkmenistan, if they can ever work out how to get the gas across the Caspian, which is a different issue. So conventionally, the middle corridor is up and running and works. Note, both of these lines go through Georgia.
Yeah.
Now, there's an issue here, which is if you're going to have the middle corridor handling much more freight traffic or handling electricity, then Georgia is one of two options, the other being the Zanzibar or Trip corridor, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But Georgia, I think, I would regard it as safe for the existing transit of oil and gas, and for anything that does not require construction of fresh infrastructure or major new infrastructure there. But when it comes to developing new infrastructure to serve Europe, what's going to be the attitude of Russia?
Mm.
What's going to be the attitude of what seems to be a pro-Russian government in Tbilisi? Can it be bought by the lure of income from serving as a transit state? Or can it be bought by the lure or the threat of intervention by Russia?
Do you think that Russia is going to try and, if we hypothetically, if we were to put more resources into Georgia, get more oil, get more electricity flowing through there, do you think that Russia would either have something to say about that, either politically, or whether it would actually try and have a direct intervention? Obviously, we know that it's tied up in Ukraine, etc. But theoretically, if everything was working in their favor, they could try and intervene to prevent that, or exert some level of control that they get funds for safe passage or something like that, because obviously Georgia is a proxy-ish.
I just think it's just that the government in Tbilisi is serving as a proxy for Russia in so many things right now. Whether or not this changes with elections is a different matter. But at the moment, that's the situation. And I don't think it's an issue of Russian military control or physical control. I think their indirect control is, from their point of view, quite satisfactory. There is one particular element, though, that concerns renewables. There are two projects that are very similar. One is for the export of 1 gigawatt, 1.3 gigawatts of energy from Georgia to Romania via a cable under the Black Sea. And the other is for 3 times that, for 3.9 gigawatts of energy from Azerbaijan. Both have been assessed by the same Italian consultants. And in about summer of 23, they said that they thought that under certain circumstances, the Georgia project might be commercially viable. The Georgian project is in the projects of common interest listed by the European Union. The Azerbaijani one, they promised the feasibility study might be come out at the time of COP29. It didn't. They just simply said we're doing the work, and there was no mention on whether or not 3.9 gigawatts from Azerbaijan was commercially feasible. The problem is, let's take the Georgian issue. Georgia says that this power for this 1.3 would come from hydropower, which is great, and that it would be primarily from new hydropower, and there's plenty of it in Georgia. So therefore, there's no problem with regard to interference from Russia, except that there is. Because the bulk of Georgia's hydropower, and indeed the bulk of its electricity throughout the country, comes from one single installation, the Angori Dam, whose control is split in effect between Georgia and the breakaway region of Abkhazia. And while the Georgians have the physical dam, it's the Abkhaz who have the power control unit. More to the point, it is assumed, one would need confirmation, that that power control unit is de facto operated by Russians. Now, the next point is then, since the Abkhaz breakaway government is actually rather angry with the Russians because it doesn't think it gets enough electricity from the dam right now for its own use, you've always got the chance of a political dispute over power coming from Angori. And if power from Angori gets cut off, then of course Georgia has to take power from elsewhere to feed the bulk of its population.
Yeah.
That means the supply to Europe will get cut if you'd had the supply to Europe.
Yeah.
So under these circumstances, who is going to make the billions of dollars of investment in Georgia required for this? I'm not saying it's impossible. I am saying it's problematic.
Yes. Yes.
The next thing is there an alternative, notably for Azerbaijan? Can you run it through the 40-kilometer corridor of Armenia, which is Armenian territory, that separates the main part of Azerbaijan from its exclave of Nakhchivan, from which you can then go across the border into Turkey? The Azerbaijanis are building a railway system on their side. They're building a railway system in Nakhchivan, and it's being connected to a railway system expansion in Turkey. So, in effect, that 40-kilometer gap looks as if it will at some point be traversed by road, rail, electricity connections. Whether this becomes a safe element of a middle corridor through to Turkey depends, of course, on a final settlement between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and we all hope that that is going to come, but we've been waiting for a few months now. And it also means, do you have the investment required for that? Which is where we have this whole concept of the Trump International Corridor there. Mm. With American investment coming in and a sort of supervisory role, so that Azerbaijani goods can flow freely across Armenia without interference, while Armenia retains its sovereignty. And dare one say it, its connection to Iran, because you have to go the other direction across the corridor to get from, because the corridor runs along the Armenian-Iranian border. So it's not a done deal.
No.
It's not settled. It's potentially promising, but it's not settled. Go on, yes.
You asked to be pressed a little bit on the second part of the original question in terms of the critical minerals. What's the role then in that, the role and the threats, other similar threats in terms of the critical minerals in that middle corridor, if we're not going to depend so much into China or other parts? What are the risks, the risky elements there on the critical minerals? Focusing obviously on renewable, the future, the renewable energy that we need.
The risks are a blockage of physical transit through Georgia and a failure to achieve an effective corridor at Zanzibar, because you have to go one or the other to get through if you're going to avoid both Russia and Iran. Now, how do I weigh those risks? I actually think that the prognosis for achieving the Zanzibar corridor is greater. It is pretty good. I mean, I think in the end, that is what we are likely to get. But you never know. Armenia has elections. What happens if you get a strong nationalist government that argues that the flight of 100,000 Armenians from the Karabakh is a justification for non-cooperation with Azerbaijan, to say the least? That is a possibility. But so long as you have something like the current government and its policies, then I think you have a good prospect for the Zanzibar corridor. Georgia, curiously enough, if you have an effective Zanzibar corridor, this might change attitudes in Georgia, because they would see potentially what they were losing. And that might encourage them, notably with regard to working out how to develop proper international conditions for the new port at Anaklia. There are, in other words, reasonable prospects in the area, but geopolitical threats hang over both of them. The point about that is rail traffic in this regard, because how do you get the critical minerals out of Central Asia? You can run them by ship across the Caspian. That is more complex than you might think, both because of the levels of sea and the development of ports on the Kazakh side and the need for new shipping in an area where shipbuilding was previously essentially confined to Russia though there is some shipbuilding in both Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, and you can't use Iranian shipbuilding for obvious reasons. So there are issues there, but they are solvable. But in the longer term, they don't come into service right now in any very large manner. So I would say that what we really are thinking about, and this goes really beyond my level of expertise, is what level of critical minerals can be exported from, shall we say, Kazakhstan by air. The air corridor may be, for the moment, the most important thing.
But if air, it's part of the solution, as we are sort of putting on the table there, that drives us away. Again, we're going back to square one in terms of fossil fuels, dependency of, air freight and everything. How would that affect, again, moving into renewables? It's a bit of a catch-22 situation, it seems to me. Do you see my point?
I wish I could say that you were wrong. I think my attitude on that is I'm simply saying that we have physical limits on Trans-Caspian. And until we can improve Trans-Caspian traffic, which basically means getting loads more ships into the Caspian, we have a problem because we can't use the trains and the rail system as efficiently as we would like. And so that's, in a sense, it's boosting the indigenous shipbuilding industries, particularly in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan.
I think as well, like sort of tying into that, when it comes to fossil fuels and the energy transition, do you, obviously, as an environmentalist, I don't like this argument, but is there sort of the argument that throughout the conversion to renewables going in that direction, that fossil fuels definitely still have a role to play as almost a fallback, that if you have any sort of supply issues, be it something that we discussed earlier with China and batteries, etc., if you have any sort of issues that regarding the transition to renewables, you still need to have the ability to fall back to fossil fuels and to use them in the interim, if you know what I mean.
I think you do need to think that fossil fuels will be with us for quite some time. There's a practical reason. One is basically that when you produce your oil and you ship it fairly easily to pretty much the end consumer. Yes, you've got to go through a refinery, but then you can just plug the output into cars or generators or whatever. Wind and solar is more complicated. You have to put it into an electricity cable and deliver it not as wind, not as solar, but as electricity. And that means you've got to build or expand or develop your grid system. And it's more complicated, not least because there are social environmental issues involved in it. How much can you afford to lay it underground at a fortune in price? Do you want to have these giant statues marching across the landscape, carrying the high voltage cables? All of these things become potentially problematic. And yet, if we're to improve the health of the planet, we need to do those things. So it's nothing that is easy, but I do think it is doable. The question is, what is the time frame? And we don't yet have practical energy storage that does not rely on fossil fuel. We don't, in other words, have batteries or sufficient things like pump storage to provide for when the wind is not blowing and sun's not shining. So gas is the most flexible of the fossil fuels, and also it's usually the least polluting. I say usually because we're starting to get quite worried about the amount of emissions that come from liquefaction of gas. But I do think that under these circumstances, we can use gas as a backup, and we should use gas as a backup. Not least because, I've been speaking for an awful long time now, and I've never mentioned Norway. And Norway has substantial resources. It's still, as it were, looking to stabilize its output at a very high level indeed, and has always been a reliable supplier to the rest of Europe. Paradoxically, of course, it uses very little gas itself. It relies on hydropower internally.
Yeah.
So
very high renewables.
This also means, that we've got a good backup, and we need that backup, and we're going to need it for quite a few years to come. And I think we're also going to need backups from other sources. Azerbaijan is an obvious one. North Africa has helped enormously. And one would hope that gas from Libya and Algeria in particular will continue to come. Just as one would hope that Morocco will eventually be able to deliver us large volumes of electricity, solar generated electricity. So there are things to happen.
Going back to this, as you mentioned, this transition where we are at the moment, I mean, we still have fossil fuels for quite a substantial amount of time. The other problem, and linking this with food security, and as we know, the global shipping industry, and we have seen the Strait of Hormuz, how things can easily get disturbed into the shipping industry. The shipping industry is heavily reliant on fossil fuels, particularly to supply food security. In the case of Europe, it's just the case, and trade with the rest of the world. How do you see that, the shipping industry being so important for trade, the global economy, so reliant on fossil fuels, moving away from that? Because we can't do without the shipping industry, the global shipping industry, and food security, for example.
There are not alternatives, but complement to the existing shipping systems. The two most obvious ones that I can think of are the possibility of more nuclear-powered vessels, and indeed modern sailing ships that rely on wind. Now, there are prototypes that operate. They seem to be quite successful. How quickly you can transform entire fleets is a very different matter, particularly at a time when you need to transport whatever oil or gas there is around the world as quickly as possible. And notice that, if you build an LNG tanker, you are building a very, very specialized tanker indeed. It's not going to be easy to transform those ships or modernize them. But again, this is where you can sort of see or imagine a situation 20 or 25 years from now that is very different from today. What is hard to envisage is how we get there. What is the impetus that will drive it? Because in the end, I suspect it has to be a political rather than a financial drive. Because on the financial side, the requirement is going to be to want to get everything out of each existing vessel as much as possible, as much use as possible. And at a time when we've got, I don't know what, I've forgotten the figure, is it 115 vessels stuck in the Hormuz?
Yeah.
That is blocking all the traffic.
Yeah.
That can't get out. That puts a premium on all the other vessels that can still carry from elsewhere in the world. But perhaps the biggest issue is simply fertilizers that you mentioned. What's it? Something like 40% of the world's fertilizer comes from production in the Gulf area. That can't get out. Some of it might manage to get out by transit across Saudi Arabia to ports in the Red Sea. But that again raises a rather delicate issue. When you close one strait like Hormuz, which comes after some months of concern concerning the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb at the entrance to the Red Sea, are we now coming to the conclusion that straits all around the world are problematic, whether it's the Malacca Strait or the Sunda Strait through Indonesia, whether it's the Kattegat between Norway and Denmark? All of these are become problematic, potentially, if we no longer have a rules-based system. I think I'm probably wrong to talk about the Danish Straits in that way, but you can see the point I'm getting at. We used to think it was taboo to block straits. What if major actors no longer consider that that is the case, so long as they have access themselves?
Yes.
We reach a point where it becomes very much a sort of, now one person's done it. Now this has been something that you can do. You set a precedent almost that if this is something that suits your general interests, this is something that you can now do.
Yeah. I mean, let me give you this is hopefully hypothetical, and please accept it's hypothetical. If there is tension between China and the United States, and it involves Russia, what would be the prospect that a Trump-like administration might seek to close the Bering Strait and cut off Russian LNG to China? All of these things, I don't expect it. I really don't. But the taboo has been broken. And that really bothers me.
And the issue of, as you mentioned, I mean, the trigger potentially, hopefully will not happen. The trigger could well be also the potential, invasion of Taiwan by China. I mean, that could be one scenario.
Exactly.
That could trigger.
I mean, that I think of all. We don't know how the Ukraine war will end. We don't know how the Hormuz crisis will end. But they will both leave very considerable legacies of uncertainty, even if actual fighting comes to an end and if something like normal commerce resumes in that wake of a closure, of an end to fighting. But I think the Taiwan issue, it would be the defining moment because of, does the rest of the world simply say, well, we can live with this because, Chinese claim Taiwan always should have been part of China, always was supposed to be one country, etc. So do we take the stance and say Taiwan, rather peculiarly, actually became a functioning democracy, became a part of a world system that didn't really want to have it as part of a world system? And what do we do to defend it and protect it if it should come under assault when it hasn't provoked the assault itself? except by simply being in existence. It really is the fundamental thing because it shapes our entire relationship to China.
Yes.
Obviously, if our relationship to China changes, the knock-on effects, not just in terms of energy, but just on pure commerce production, is magnificent.
Yeah, we have no way of knowing whether at this point we would stand up to China in the event of a Chinese assault, because so much depends on the United States and so much depends on how much the president of the United States, whoever the president is, regards it as, someone said, a personal insult as well as a strategic issue for the country.
Well, the US, they have sort of resurrected, shall we say, the Monroe Doctrine by the end of last year, and that also changes their relationship with the world. I mean, obviously, they are taking unilateral action as a consequence of their redefinition of the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes, exactly. And that is the corollary of the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes.
Ought to be that you others have your interests in your area and we don't interfere in them, and you don't interfere in ours, which means Europe has to solve its problems on its own with Russia. Asia has to solve its problems on its own with China.
Yeah.
And Australia, well, who cares? If you're the United States, who cares? If you are other countries, you may care quite considerably.
Wow. Huge topics, huge topics.
Yeah,
we might need a second part, Oliver, of this. I mean, we've been nearly an hour and a half. It's very interesting.
definitely. I mean, I was literally trying to think. I was like, we've got to wrap this up somehow, but I don't quite know how because everything was like you're saying is so interesting and it's so good. So, yeah, I was like, I don't want to end this, but we have to end it at some point. But maybe definitely got a part two of this because there's so much more to cover here. There's so much more to get out of this topic because it's such a big one as well because it encompasses so much of our what we just take for granted, our reality. I think, especially, I mean, the first time when we had 22 and we had the Ukraine shock and we had people rushing out to the petrol stations and things like that. I remember seeing someone filling a literal shopping bag with petrol. And it's when you see these sort of things, it just makes you realize how much energy, though we don't think about it every day. Like, I have a desk light on. I don't think about the fact that that's got to come from somewhere until that gets put in jeopardy and that gets taken away. And all of a sudden, these things you just take for granted suddenly are really important and are really valuable. And yeah, I think it's a really, really fascinating and encompassing topic. So maybe if you're up for it, we can do a part two at some point in the near future.
And as geopolitics change, anyway.
Exactly, yeah, because at the moment everything's sort of in the flux, isn't it? It's all changing so quickly. Like every time you look at something, it's changed.
May I offer a final thought?
Absolutely.
We are in the middle of a technological revolution that is enabling the energy transition. It is being held up by crises such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the all-out one, we had the previous one, and Hormuz. But it is still happening. We don't quite know at what point we'll get to a stage where we really do feel comfortable about reliance on fossil fuels, and we have about reliance on renewables, and when we also feel that we have a better form of backup than continued reliance on fossil fuels. But I think it's coming. I think the crises that we've had and the way in which we responded, particularly the way in which Europe responded in the wake of the Russian gas cutoffs, shows that when we're up against it, we can actually respond without losing everything. So while I think we've got a tough few years ahead of us, I think the introduction of new technologies will enable us to get through this.
Yeah, and that's what we've all got to look to the future, isn't it? Now, like, can't go back, can't change anything. So onwards, and let's see what happens in the future. But yeah, thank you so much, John, for joining us for the podcast today. It's been genuinely eye-opening. Like, it's been such a fascinating conversation. So thank you so much for coming on. And thank you to everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to follow the podcast and share it with someone who you think would also find it interesting. We'll be going on from here. We'll be continuing these sorts of conversations, these sort of discussions in the not too distant future, maybe a part 2 with John. So stay tuned until next time. See ya.
Thank you.